Hi, everyone. Welcome to this brief tutorial for Sentio supervisors on using the OQ analyst to access and analyze the outcome data for your supervisees and their clients. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump right in. So when you log into the OQ analyst software, this is what you'll see. And for most of you to access the outcome data, you click on the reporting tab here, and you click on individual, which is here. I have the default supervisor name here as Joe. You'll get a sense of my TV preferences from the mid to late 90s as we go. But we're going to switch from the default supervisor, which would be your name if you're pulling this up on your account, to the name of your supervisee, your counselor, which in this case is Elaine Bennis. And then from there, you just click on Generate Client Status Report, and you'll see all of Elaine's clients come up. Now, something to keep in mind, for most of you, this is all you'll need to access the outcome data for your supervisees. But for a few of you, especially if you're a couples supervisor only working with couples clients, because of a quirk in the OQ system where we can only assign one supervisee per counselor, you may have to access outcome data slightly differently. And I'll show you what that looks like towards the end of this video. So stick with me, and then at the end, I'll show you how to pull up data if your supervisee has clients that you can't access by this approach. So when you pull up this individual report, there's a lot of information here. You can see the session number, so the number of sessions each client has had, the last administration date, and this shows you how recently a client's filled it out, whether this client is a part of an individual or a couple, the current score, so what their most recent submission of the OQ has totaled in terms of the score, and we'll talk about what those numbers mean in a bit, but higher scores mean more distress, and then the empirical alert and the rational alert. And something to note here, I'm actually not 100% sure what the difference is, but the biggest takeaway is that if you ever see a client on this report here that's in the red or in the yellow, that's often a client you want to check in on with the counselor. Maybe that's the person you want to spend time reviewing in supervision and do some deliberate practice around how to support them as best. But what you want to do if you identify a specific client that you want to look into is go to the far right here and click on the clinician report for that client. And so the client we're going to use as an example here is the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Will Smith. When I click this, you may not see it. For a lot of people, this pops up in a separate window. So you may need to turn off your pop-up blocker. But I'm just going to briefly switch to share the clinician report here. Perfect. So I'm going to take some time and go over what all of this means in case you want to look at like a specific client's more detailed data in your supervision. So the first thing to point out is the alert status here, which says green. And you can look down at the bottom of the screen here and see that green correlates to, in their key, that the client is making expected progress, right? So that's good. If you see a client who's in the red, that's a high chance of a negative outcome or deterioration. If you see a client who's yellow, that's some chance of a negative outcome. And all of this is based on hundreds of thousands of data points that the OQ has aggregated in the decades that they've been having this software. So that's what that means. A client who's white means they're functioning in the normal range. Of course, normal is a bit subjective, but for the OQ software, that means under this dotted orange line here, which is the clinical cutoff of 64. I'll talk more about the graph in a second, but staying up towards the top of your screen here and moving on to these 5 critical items. The OQ will always flag these 5 questions in this clinician report because they're related to some of the most important things you'd want to talk to your supervisee about if a client endorses these things. So suicidality, concerns related to substance use, and then workplace dissatisfaction, like specifically a client doing something that they might regret. We instruct all of our counselors, if a client ever answers these as anything other than never, to bring it into supervision to assess with their client. So it's not uncommon that a client might endorse something like rarely, sometimes, even frequently, and the counselors know to ask the clients about that. And it'd be something that you might want to check in with your supervisee as well. And then the last thing up here in the upper right are these subscales. And this gets a bit granular. Not all of our counselors pay attention to this, which is fine. But in case you're curious to know what these mean, symptom distress is just about like overall level of functioning, things that might be tied to things like depression, anxiety, trauma, etc. The interpersonal relations category is more specific to close relationships, like romantic relationships, family, close friends, etc. And then the social role subscale has to do with work or school. So you can see here, just kind of looking at this example of Will Smith's OQ information, that he's pretty consistently elevated compared to the community norms, but not so much compared to the outpatient norms. And that could just be some valuable insight into his overall level of functioning. But then looking at this graph, this is something that we instruct our counselors to pay a lot of attention to. Important thing to consider is that for the graph, you want to see a downward slope. A smaller number means less distress. A higher number means a greater amount of distress. And so what we want to see for all of our clients, ideally, is a trend line that goes down. Of course, it's possible that all of our clients will have this kind of progress, but that is what we're looking for. As I mentioned, this dotted green line is the clinical cutoff, reflecting the difference between somebody who's functioning at a level where therapy would be recommended versus somebody where therapy might not be needed or recommended at that time. And then this darker gray line, I believe that indicates for a client who starts at that specific score, in this case, 90, like the average trend line for all clients who started at that score in the history of the OQ. Something else to note here is to change the amount of administrations on the graph. Will Smith here only has 5. It always defaults to 10. So if you have a supervisee with a client that's been seen for more than 10 times and you want to see the entirety of the graph, you just click here and select all. In case you're wondering even further, to get a bit more granular into what some of these numbers mean. So the OQ, based on their algorithm and their hundreds of thousands of data points, suggests that a score between 64 to 82 is in the moderate distress range. A score between 83 and 105 is moderate to high. And then 105 and up is considered a high level of distress. And the way this score is totaled is there's 45 questions on the OQ, and they're just on a Likert scale from 0 to 4. So somebody who answers all of them with the maximum amount of distress would be at a 180. And somebody who's achieved nirvana as a Zen monk might be closer to 0, having no distress. And something that I think is worth sharing is there is a lot of subjectivity here. So a client using Will Smith here, a client who has an OQ score of 69 at this point, or is a 90 when he comes in, that might mean something different to him than another client who has these numbers. And so we always ask our counselors to follow up with clients and get a sense of what this graph reflects to them. The same thing is true for the critical items up here, using the question of suicidality as an example. I'd say in my anecdotal experience, maybe 25% of my clients will answer something other than negative. And usually it's one tick above negative, which is rarely. And it doesn't always mean they're actively suicidal. In fact, it often does not mean that. So we want to take this quantitative information, but then bring it to the clients to better understand qualitatively what it means to them. And a lot of what you'd be doing in supervision when you're working with OQ is asking your supervisee to better understand how this reflects the client's level of functioning, what they're working on in therapy, et cetera. And the last 2 things on the clinician report here, the feedback message. We don't like this. We tell all of our counselors to ignore it. You can ignore it as well. But then down here, this is somewhat useful. We don't require that our counselors review it, but the OQ will automatically pull questions that were answered towards the high end of the Likert scale. So in this case, you could kind of get a perspective on what are the things that are causing Will Smith here the most distress, and that might be something useful to talk about in supervision in terms of how your supervisee can bring this into session. I'm going to exit this clinician report here, and I'm actually going to pull up a different one. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And then we're going to pull up the clinician report for Joey Tribbiani. In case you are a fan of Friends, that is the reference. And I'm showing you this one because this is for a client who has only completed 1 OQ entry. So this is a client that has either not even had his first session yet or has only had 1 session. And so what you'll see here is everything looks the same except for the graph. Since we don't have a point A and a point B for the second session, it actually plots Joey Tribbiani's current score, in this case just coincidentally, based on me just filling out OQs quickly to get these logged for our fake clients here. This is also current score of 69. And so you can see what this looks like compared to a community sample, right? And then also people in EAPs, people in mental health centers, people in inpatient treatment. So if you happen to look at an OQ for a client who's only had 1 session, you'll see something like this, and it just gives you a good idea of what that client, what their level of distress might be like compared to community norms. And then the last clinician report I'm going to pull here is for Monica Geller. Again, these are all made-up people based on sitcoms from the mid to late 90s that I used to watch and still do occasionally. And here is Monica's OQ graph. And I've constructed this to show what it looks like when a client is in deterioration. This is obviously somebody who's in a fair amount of distress. Her current OQ score here is 115, which is very high. Not anywhere near the highest we've seen, but enough that you'd want to talk to your supervisee about it for sure. What I haven't pointed out is that all the session dates are the same because I just threw these together, the day before I'm recording this today. But you'll see this spread out from week to week for a regular OQ. There's a few things to point out here. One is the trend line is going up. So this is a client who's not only in a high level of distress, but is in an increasing level of distress throughout treatment. So you would definitely want to focus on a client like this with your supervisee in supervision to understand what's happening with the client and what specifically you can work on in supervision to help that client reduce her level of distress. You also see here that I've had Monica endorse sometimes on the question about suicidality. So ideally, in this case, your supervisee would have already done a risk assessment in a session with Monica, and if needed, based on your supervisee's clinical judgment, would have proceeded to maybe even do a safety plan. We see that Monica here has endorsed rarely for the questions related to substance abuse. So this is another thing that your supervisee ideally would have just asked about in session to see if a further assessment is needed. But otherwise, in terms of interpreting what's on this clinician report here, it's all pretty much the same, except it indicates this client is in a high level of distress. This client is feeling worse over the course of therapy, and there's some suicidality present. So you want to make sure you're understanding what's happening with this client when you talk with your supervisee. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the OQ dashboard here. As promised, I mentioned that for some of you, especially if you're only working with couples cases, you might not be designated as a counselor's primary supervisor. And that means when you go to this screen here, let me actually show you. So I'm going to log off. And I'm going to log back in as a different supervisee named Cosmo Kramer. And so if we follow the same steps to pull up our counselor's outcome data, what you used to be able to do in the OQ, and hopefully you'll be able to do it again, which is why I'm mentioning it here, is simply pull up the individual report, and with your name showing here, so this would be you as the supervisor, you'd click Include Secondary Assignments right here. You tick that box, and what that would allow is to show the OQ outcome data for clients that we've tagged you as part of the treatment team, which is our way of circumventing the fact that only one supervisor can be assigned to any given counselor. If we add you, a different supervisor, to the treatment team for any number of clients, you can see their OQ data. So you click Generate Client Status Report. Unfortunately, this no longer works in the OQ software. I expect them to fix this, which is why I'm leaving this in here. But in the meantime, I want to show you all a workaround for how to access the OQ data for clients that you can't see through this approach. And the way to do that is you go back to Home up here, just your basic dashboard, and you tick Include Treatment Team Assignments here to the left. And so not only would you see clients that you supervise, but you'll see clients that you've been included on the treatment team for. So in this case, we're going to see a number of couples clients that you saw in the other individual report from 5 minutes ago. And here we have Ross and Rachel from Friends. We have Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv from The Fresh Prince. And so you can see it's not that different, right? You see the same thing, the empirical color, the total score. You can click on the clinician report here. You can see the name of the counselor. The only difference is this doesn't just show you the most recent OQ score from a particular client. This will show you all of the scores from a fixed period, and it defaults to, as you can see on the left, the last 10 days. So it might look like there's a lot of clients here, but in actuality, it's only 4 clients who have filled this all out twice. So you just have to pay a little bit more attention when you're looking at this so that you're not inadvertently getting a misrepresentation of how your supervisee might be doing. If, let's say, they have a client who's deteriorating and that client's filled out a number of OQs in the last few weeks, it might look like they have a lot of clients deteriorating when in actuality it's just one. Much as, we see Rachel here who's in the green, but then she's also in, since there's only one session here that you don't have the empirical color. But anyway, this is the workaround. So if you are a couple supervisor or you have supervisees where you are not their primary supervisor in the software, you just find the dashboard here, click Include Treatment Team Assignments, click Refresh, and here you can see all the recent OQ submissions by your supervisee. Thanks so much. Let me just look at my notes real quick just to make sure I didn't forget anything before I close the video. And oh yeah, just the only other note, all the administration dates, as you can see, is 4/3 here as well. Again, that's because all of this was created kind of quickly. But what you'll see for clients normally is just weekly sessions. But that's it. Hope you found this informative. Feel free to shoot me an email at bfeynman@sentiocc.org if you have any follow-up questions. And thanks so much.